because in their mind, oh, Vladimir Putin was as good as gone. Well, guess what? No, he's still there. You're the ones who have left over time, over these 2.5 years. The only reason we're not in that reality is because you lost on the battlefield and in the economy. You lost on both fronts, and that's why you're now frustrated that Russia is in the position you guys wanted to be in. Let's call a spade a spade. Hello, my friends, I hope you're all doing well. Today is Friday, November the 8th, and I bring you a story that's better than any other story we have covered on the channel in a long while. In fact, this is so good, it should be on the front page of every single news publication out there, but it's not because politics. However, luckily for us, Ukrainska Pravda of all news outlets has published it, and I am thankful. And I can't wait to share it with you. Do you know all of those things that we've been saying about the Zelensky regime, about the dictatorship, the democracy in Ukraine, all of those things? Well, guess what? A Ukrainian MP has written a letter to Donald Trump in which he calls the Zelensky regime out for what it truly is. And believe me, no words were spared. It's very descriptive, and I must say, nobody has ever called Zelensky out so bad as this guy does, openly and outspokenly. So, let's begin there. Controversial Ukrainian MP writes letter to Trump and urges Zelensky to engage in dialogue with Russia. Ukrainian president's office responds. Well, first of all, why is he so controversial? Well, I guess because of what we're about to read, you know? When people say something that the Zelensky regime doesn't agree with, well, they're immediately labeled controversial, and that's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario, you disappear like a Houdini. Ukrainian MP Yevhen Shevchenko has announced that he has written a letter to US President-elect Donald Trump asking him to help stop Ukraine's slide into dictatorship and urged Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to engage in dialogue with the aggressor state of Russia. Well, even though this gesture is absolutely commendable, I mean, I'm very close to giving him a round of applause, I think this letter has been written a very long time ago, but the reason they haven't sent it and published it until now is because for the first time in the history of this conflict, these people like Yevhen Shevchenko and others who are not on the side of Zelensky, they feel like they have support from the other side. And by the other side, I don't mean Russia, I mean from across the Atlantic. Because we know the Biden administration and whoever's really pulling the strings behind Biden, I think they've given Zelensky free rein to do whatever he wanted to do. And he's done exactly what they wanted him to do. But for the first time, the situation has changed. And this is why we now see people coming out against the Zelensky regime. Listen to this, because this first quote is absolutely priceless. Quote, "It's high time, Comrade President, to start a dialogue. I understand that you'll have to leave afterwards, but the country comes before personal ambitions. I'll help you if you need it. I'll go to Minsk again. We'll solve everything. All you have to do is start. If you're unwilling, you will be forced to leave, forced by those in the Western world who were applauding you just yesterday." I mean, just a moment of silence for the truth that's emanating from that quote. It's absolutely priceless. These are the same things, my friends, that you and I have been saying for such a long time. And many others, many others. Everybody who uses the sense of reason and logic got to the same conclusion. But let's analyze his quote. He's saying, "It's high time, Comrade President." Why the word comrade? I think it's because maybe Mr. Shevchenko is trying to symbolize the fact that it's not exactly a democracy in Ukraine. It's probably something more of akin to what we've seen in the USSR. Just a thought over there, a personal thought. Then he says, "I understand that you'll have to leave afterwards." Well, guess what? That's exactly the reason he's clinging on to power. Because Mr. Shevchenko is totally right. He will have to leave afterwards. Because this conflict, it will end at the negotiating table one way or another. At least that's what the current indicators point at. And he will not survive that. Politically, there's no way he will survive that. Zelensky I'm talking about. Then he's saying, but the country comes before personal ambitions. Oh, ain't that the truth? However, that was not the case in Ukraine, because we know that all of the decisions that have been made, especially in the last year, have all been for one single reason: headlines. That's the sad part. It wasn't even, yes, it was for the personal ambitions, but it got Ukraine nowhere closer to actually achieving something. Everything that was done, starting with the Kursk incursion, the counteroffensive, even the counteroffensive, it was all for the headlines. That was a debacle. Kursk is another debacle that I don't think we will survive the next couple of months. And there we have it. Everything for the headline. That's what Mr. Shevchenko's talking about. He's talking about Zelensky's personal ambitions. Let's be honest here. Then he's saying, I'll go to Minsk again. And I think that's exactly where he's wrong. I don't think there's going to be another Minsk agreement type of negotiation between Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and the West, ever again. Or at least in our lifetime. You know, that was such a sour experience for the Russians. They've been absolutely double-crossed, and they know that. And it will take many, many generations and a lot of politicians changing seats before the Russians will trust the West to a degree that's necessary in order to engage in those types of talks again. Then moving forward, he's saying, we'll solve everything. All you have to do is start. If you're unwilling, you will be forced to leave. That's so true. It has been very apparent, at least for about a year now, that the Western governments will one day, in the not-so-distant future, ask and push for Zelensky to sit down with Vladimir Putin and negotiate an end to the conflict. Why? Well, not because the Western governments have had a change of heart. No. It's because the sanctions that they've started to impose on Russia have backfired and have absolutely destroyed every single European economy. Maybe Hungary not so much, but the rest of them are in tatters, to quote a classic. That's why. But when that time comes, as in right now, Zelensky will not be willing to do it, because the Western politicians will have to choose. Do we sacrifice someone in a green t-shirt, or do we face the music? And guess what? It's an easy choice. Of course they don't want to face the music, and that leaves the green t-shirt to be put into the headlight, into the spotlight. He doesn't want to be in the spotlight. He wants to keep convincing us that war is necessary. We need to fight them over there so you don't have to fight them over here, and all of that bullshit. But I think, as Mr. Shevchenko is saying, time is up. So let's move on. In another post, Shevchenko announced that he would submit a bill to the Ukrainian parliament in a bid to put an end to the political persecution against Ukrainian MPs. And then he gives a few names here: Alexander Dubinsky, Artem Dimitriuk, I mean, there's a lot of them. And also at the end, notice he's mentioning Alexei Arestovich. So Arestovich, I'm sure you're familiar with him. He was very close to Zelensky in the early days of the war. And then as reality has set in, Arestovich actually was more of a fan of reason than Zelensky was. And obviously that created a rupture, and Arestovich is no longer in the picture. And then he's saying, Ms. Shevchenko that is, all of them and many others should return to Ukraine, having the opportunity to continue their enlightening work freely and calming, the MP said. Well, Mr. Shevchenko, I don't know about enlightening work. I wouldn't go that far, but I get it. You've got your point across. We understand you very well. Also, from that, I understand that currently there's not a lot of democracy in Ukraine, but that's not what the United States tells us. And the EU, they say, well, we have to fight for the Ukrainian democracy. We have to fight them there, so we don't have to fight them over here. So, Mr. Shevchenko, you're saying there's no democracy in Ukraine. I can't believe that. I don't believe you. Have you checked under the bed? I'm sure the democracy is somewhere in there. Just look for it just a little bit harder, Mr. Shevchenko. Quote, I've written a letter to Donald Trump and US Vice President-elect J.D. Vance seeking their help to stop the rise of authoritarianism, dictatorship, and lawlessness in Ukraine, and to restore democracy and freedom of speech to its political landscape, Shevchenko said. Well, hold on a second, Mr. Shevchenko. Again, you've got your point across, but I think you're taking it one step too far. Speaking of all of those things, where was it? Authoritarianism, dictatorship. That's the landscape, not from 2022 onwards, but from about 2014 onwards. The difference was, instead of having the green t-shirt there, we had the three-letter agencies, you know, those from across the Atlantic who were really commanding Ukraine, and the head of them was Victoria the Cookies Nuland. That was the only difference. But please try and do not make it sound like dictatorship and lawlessness. They're only present in Ukraine in the last 2.5 years, because that's not the case. It's been there for the last 8 years and counting. That's the only mention that I will have to that. Also, the fact that he's bringing up those words, authoritarianism, dictatorship, and lawlessness, well, that's exactly what it is. But that's not what the White House is telling us. That's not what Brussels is telling us. However, every single indication points towards that. Bravo, Mr. Shevchenko, bravo. Andrei Yermak, head of the Ukrainian president's office, or here we go, responded to the MP's comments on his Telegram account, stating that Ukraine's only path to victory against the aggressor lies in President Zelensky's victory plan and peace formula. Mr. Yermak, when you lead with victory plan, peace formula, these buzzwords, you're not being taken seriously. You cannot be taken seriously, because those are things, those are concepts that only exist and work in Zelensky's mind, and it's more of a wishful thinking rather than something actionable, something tangible. You cannot make those things happen. Your boss knows it. I hope you do too. I hope you haven't bought into this, Mr. Yermak. But the fact that Mr. Yermak had to come and make those statements, I think is being pushed by the green t-shirt. I cannot imagine anybody, green t-shirt included, actually believing in that. It's just baffling. How can you think that the victory plan is something that the West will support him in? Or the peace formula? The peace formula is just as unrealistic as the victory plan. Tomato. Quote, some MPs seem to be confused about national security, national interest, and the future of the country. That's Yermak. If they believe that national interest equate to Ukraine's defeat, they are gravely mistaken. And acting in the interest of the Russian Federation, Ukraine's victory plan, the peace formula, it's the way to justice. You keep using that word justice. That doesn't make you sound like a serious person. When you're a diplomat, justice is not a word that should come out of your mouth very often. That's a word for the people. We can say justice as much as we want until the microphone runs out of battery. But when you're a high-level diplomat, your word should not be justice. You should not speak in those terms. Justice is an absolutist term. That should not be part of your vocabulary. This is why people cannot take you seriously. And believe me, like Yermak is not, there's many in the EU Parliament. You hear them all the time with justice, and whenever you hear that word from a politician, just please look away. But again, he's trying to prop up the peace plan and the victory plan and the peace formula. Let's not waste any more time on that. My friends, that's the news. Honestly, I think it's the best thing that has happened to Ukraine in a long time. Now, maybe I'm not familiar with Mr. Shevchenko, I must admit. I don't know who he is. I haven't followed him. But the sheer fact that this is now public and people get to see it, I wish it was publicized a little bit more in the West. I couldn't find this news anywhere else, for that matter. But the more people see this, especially outsiders, not Ukrainians, because Ukrainians know what the situation is, they know what time it is, but for the rest of the Europeans and the Americans, I think the more people start to realize, why is it necessary to end this already? But don't go just yet, because now we have a look at what the White House has been saying. You know, one of our favorites, not favorites, Matthew Miller, the spokesperson for the US State Department, he's made a few statements. They're trying to wash their hands and twist the words in their traditional fashion. Listen to this one. Quote, well, actually, let me read you the title. US to back Ukraine's talks with Russia if Zelensky is ready. Quote from Matthew Miller. That has been our policy, our long-standing policy that is up for President Zelensky to decide when it's time for negotiations. It's not something that is appropriate for us or for any other country to push him into his rest. Oh, really? So by the same token, Mr. Matthew Miller, it wouldn't have been appropriate for you to push him to continue this tragedy. You, Boris Johnson, and other people who are no longer among us on the political scene, who have been touched by Zelensky and they magically disappear from their political positions, all of you have supported him into continuing this. That was appropriate. But to try and convince him that, look, wake up, that's not appropriate, right? That doesn't fall under your attributions, Mr. Miller. All of a sudden, you're very sanctimonious. Quote, but as always, and you can just look at the statements that he continues to make, we have seen no indication from Vladimir Putin that he's willing to drop his demand to continue to gobble up Ukrainian territory, he said. No, Mr. Miller, Vladimir Putin doesn't need to give you any sort of indication about anything. Let's take it a step back. Who broke the contact between Russia and the United States? Was it the Russians? No, it was you. So, naturally, you should be the one making the first step. And that's exactly what Vladimir Putin will say in a second. We're gonna take a look at that. You should be the one establishing contact. Vladimir Putin is not in the business of sending you signals in Morse code or lightening a light on the sky so you can try to interpret what that means. No, you need to put your hand on the phone, call Vladimir Putin and say, hey Vlad, how would you like this to end? You know, those famous words? And then see if you can be on the same page. But Vladimir Putin doesn't need to send you indications. I wish reporters would call them out on this bullshit. Miller also expressed confidence that Putin had agreed to negotiations in which he would accept where he gets everything that he wants and Ukraine gets nothing that is entitled to under the law. Guess what? That's exactly the same position you yourselves wanted to be in and leave Russia on the outside. The only reason we're not in that reality is because you lost on the battlefield and in the economy. You lost on both fronts, and that's why you're now frustrated that Russia is in the position you guys wanted to be in. Let's call a spade a spade. Mr. Miller, I mean, I probably shouldn't be picking on him because he just says what the teleprompter tells him. But it's so aggravating to see this type of double speak. It's so fake. Quote, but this is not a negotiation that President Zelensky has been interested in, nor should it be, he concluded. Of course, because you take your orders from President Zelensky. Give me a break. Give me a break. The only reason you propped him up so much is because he was making you money. Well, he was making the MIC money, and therefore he was making you money. That's the reason you prop Zelensky up, but don't try to sit there and convince us that, well, if Zelensky doesn't want to, there's nothing we can do. Really? Donald Trump will prove you very wrong, I think. Also, speaking of Donald Trump, I think this is the reason for why we see people like Mr. Shevchenko and others, and also Europeans, who actually come and speak some common sense. Why? Well, because they feel, for the first time, like I said in this conflict, that they have some support from across the Atlantic, which means that a lot of people have been going along with the lie, even though they knew it was a lie. But now they say, well, we must do something. Oh, really? When have you realized that? On the 5th of November? Or have you known that since maybe the 5th of November last year? Okay, let's move on to another story, my friends. This one very quick. I just want to mention something. These are the consequences of the power outages, among other things. Departure of Ukrainians abroad after prolonged power outages exceeds Ukrainian National Bank's forecast. Rising pressure on businesses in Ukraine due to a worker shortage in the third quarter of 2024 was largely driven by higher than expected migration outflows, especially as prolonged power outages over the summer prompted more people to move abroad. Very true. But also there's another reason that I am sure they don't want to talk about, and that is the Russian progress that's been made on the battlefield since the end of summer. People pay attention to those things, and given the amount of land that the Russians have managed to insert themselves upon in just 3 months, people pay attention to that. And more people, especially from the center of Ukraine, from the Dnipro area, they have started slowly but very shortly to actually leave. Of course, they will not mention such a thing in here, but we know it's a reality. The more people lose faith in their government, the more they leave. That's a fact of life. It's been true for thousands of years, and it will probably be true for thousands more. And the last thing I'll mention in today's video, my friends, is Vladimir Putin. Again, another article from Ukrainska Pravda. We've had 4 articles all from Ukrainska Pravda. but these are decent ones. Putin explains why he hasn't called Trump. Now, I don't think we needed an explanation. I think it was very self-explanatory, but he's given an explanation, and basically he's just reading the writing on the wall. Listen to this. I don't think it would be inappropriate for me to call him, but I'm not doing it because Western leaders used to call me almost weekly, then suddenly stopped. Well, if they don't want to, that's fine. So that's exactly the situation that we've been in. For a while, there was some sort of normality between the West and Russia, mostly because they love that cheap Russian gas, and then it just stopped. It stopped because someone or some entity managed to convince all of these people like Olaf Scholz and Macron and von der Leyen and all of these, they've convinced these people that a sanctions war, an economic war on Russia, could be won, and quite easily actually. They've bought into that. They've cut all contact with Vladimir Putin because in their mind, oh, Vladimir Putin was as good as gone. Well, guess what? No, he's still there. You're the ones who have left over time, over these 2.5 years. It was you, actually, who had to vacate your positions, but he's still there. So now, Vladimir Putin is showing a little bit of ego here, which is necessary. After all, he's the president of the Russian Federation. Russia means something in the world, people. No matter on which side you're on, if you're on no side, then even better. I'm sure you can see these things. There were always, how should we call them? Centers of power. There was the United States. There was Russia. These two have been there for a very long time. But Russia is a top-tier power. It always was, regardless of what people say about socialism and whatever. Russia, in one way or another, it was always a big center of power of the highest order. Vladimir Putin is the president of that. There has to be some sort of ego involved. That's just the way things work. It's the same with the United States. Do you think the US would just magically call people who have purposely cut contact with them? Absolutely not. US does the same. They wait until people admit their mistakes, if mistakes have been made. And boy, mistakes have been made here by the bucket. But this is the situation. And then just the last thing that Putin says, if any of them want to re-establish contact, I always say, we have nothing against it. Please, we are ready to resume contacts and engage in discussions. And that just goes to show that the Russians, Vladimir Putin specifically, they've been thinking of life after the war in Ukraine. And I remember, I think it was middle of 2022, before anybody realized how long this conflict will be. If we could just suspect, but we didn't know for sure. I remember Vladimir Putin at the time was making statements about life after the war. And I was scratching my head and thinking, well, it's probably going to be tomorrow or it's going to be in 5 years. But he was thinking about that from the very beginning. He realized what the West has convinced themselves that it doesn't exist. And that is life after war. You know, when all of this is said and done, Russia and the West should be working together, or should be at least collaborating and having cordial relations. Vladimir Putin saw that. The West didn't, which is why he's still there, and most of the politicians in the West have found their way out. But my friends, I wish you a fantastic evening, a great weekend ahead. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, it's been an absolute pleasure. Take care and bye-bye.